Okay,
Yes.
so good morning, everybody. So today we're going to talk a little bit about geography. It's an axis of data that I think IE folks are all like inquisitive about, and we get a lot of requests from people about different geographies. But there's often difficulty kind of knowing what it is that we're supposed to be looking at, what some of the pitfalls are, what are some of the social concerns that come about with geography, and what are some of the exciting things we can do with geography? And then, of course, the big question about how do we use geography? Many of us were not necessarily trained as geographers. I certainly wasn't. I sort of am self-taught. And so you'll see some of the pitfalls that I've fallen into as I've taught myself this. But hopefully this will provide you a good grounding on, not only just some basic practical tools that you can use, but also some really interesting historical and sort of social considerations that we always have to consider when we're including geography as a potential axis of analysis. So I'm from Long Beach City College. I'm down in the, I live in Orange County, but we're of course in LA County, at the southern tip of LA County. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is really particularly useful for urban colleges. But I think there's some interesting things, Karen's going to talk about some things sort of statewide and her experience. But I'm sure there's many of you who are from more rural areas who will find this information important as well. All right, so why do we use geographic data? And so here are some 4 case studies that I've kind of used in my analytical toolbox over the years. So one is it helps us really determine patterns in enrollment. And I'll dig into some of the political considerations that come with this as we go through some of these cases. The second, it provides us a means of approximating some unobserved demographic characteristics. For those of you who work in non-credit land, of which I'm familiar with because I work in non-credit land, this is particularly important because many times we don't have a lot of great demographic information from, say, tools like FAFSA. And so geography can be a good way of approximating that. Third is it enables us to focus on analytics for our elected officials. For those of you who work with elected officials, you know that they are concerned about what happens in their district and what only happens in their district, regardless of whether that's an important breakout for our work or not. This can be a really useful tool for trying to advocate on behalf of our students. And then the fourth, it allows us to do some high-level statistical methodologies. And I'll bore you with some work that I did in my graduate program using some advanced analytical tools that we have through GIS. So the first thing I want to talk about is patterns of enrollment. And for those of you who are sleepy-eyed, I'll start showing you some pretty maps. So hopefully that will make things more exciting. So patterns of enrollment are particularly important for urban colleges. And the reason why I say that is we often find ourselves in situations where the students that our political entity is supposed to serve often are not correctly aligned with the students we actually serve. So this is a map that I made for our institutional self-evaluation for our creditor. I didn't wind up using it, but I still like the map anyway, so we're going to use it for this presentation. And you can see that this blue area here is our actual district, but there's a considerable part of our enrollment that comes from outside of our district. In total, this amounts to about 45% of our student enrollment comes from outside of our district, which interestingly enough means that those students don't actually have representation on our board of trustees. It means that they don't have representation in the voting demographics of our group and how we define districts. So it creates an interesting constituency of how, of course, we as a college serve all of our students, but our board members and our elected officials may not necessarily always think about these students that live outside of our boundary lines. So it also is important for how we might motivate policy internally. What types of high schools are we reaching out to? Do we go beyond to Linwood High School, which is outside of our district? Do we go beyond to Phineas Banning High School, which is right outside of our district? Of course, the answer is yes, because these are where our students come from. But that may be a conversation that we have with our different constituent groups about how we expand beyond just the boundaries that have been set aside by past demographics. And I'll show you a little bit about some of the interesting politics that came about with that. The other interesting things is it shows us really interesting patterns. We have a hard line on the Orange County border. For some reason, we do not attract a lot of students from Orange County, even though many of these students are closer to our college than many of the other colleges that actually are in Orange County. And then, there's also other policies like how might we engage transit agencies to make sure our transportation needs are focused on our students. We operate in the Long Beach Transit Agency service area, but many of our students who live outside of Long Beach actually are in Metro LA. So how do we make sure that when we provide, say, a bus pass program, we're reaching the most students we can while still being fiscally responsible and considering of those considerations? So I want to focus a little bit on why we need to be cognizant of the racial and social impacts of where colleges are placed. Something we often don't think about. But our colleges, frequently were created in waves that follow different patterns of immigration to California. So Long Beach, as well as Fullerton College and Santa Ana, were part of this first wave of California immigration from the East that came about, right around World War I and a little bit of period into the interwar period. You can see, we had 1927, 1913, 1915. These locations have not changed, even though the patterns of demographics in LA and Orange County have changed dramatically since 1927. You can see that we had another wave after World War II, El Camino, LA Harbor College, Orange Coast College, and then we had a huge wave that followed after the 1950s into the 1960s. And what this largely reflects is periods of municipal incorporation. There was just a huge suburban influx after the 1950s that occurred in LA Orange County. So what does this mean to our colleges? Well, this means that a lot of the different racial politics that existed in the 1920s, very problematic, very segregatory policies that limited access to low-income communities of color and that embedded anti-Semitism frequently into our urban incorporation, means that also is embedded in just simply where our colleges are placed. Long Beach City College is based in a largely residential community in North Long Beach. That is not where the bulk of our enrollment is. The bulk of our enrollment is in downtown Long Beach. But that wasn't what our policymakers were considering in 1927. So how do we break through some of those barriers? And that's difficult, but it's something we have to be cognizant of. Using and being mindful of some of these geographic tools is really important for that. So, how do I make maps like this? How do I, incorporate some of these historical mindsets into when we looking at enrollment patterns? So, some of the key considerations we have are Geo Codes. Geo Codes is how we turn the process of turning actual student locational information, so addresses, zip codes, et cetera, into points on a map. And that point level geographic consideration is really, the core of everything you do in GIS. I'll show you some tools on how we do that geocoding. It's actually free. Actually, it's easier than I think some people think it is. I've seen people pay consultants to do it. You don't necessarily need to do that. And the other thing is shapefiles. Shapefiles are the actual polygons that form the basis of district boundaries, state boundaries, zip code boundaries, etc. And then, rasters are just sort of the images that occur. Like if we wanted to look at satellite imagery, we don't necessarily need to use that all that much in this type of work. Some of you who are in rural areas, maybe that is more important, but for urban parts, it's certainly useful to figure out why we might not have enrollment in a certain area. In our case, we have a big port. We would not expect a lot of students to live at the port. But frequently at an urban college, we are kind of cognizant of that already. So what are some ways we can do this in the most cost-effective manner? Well, my tool that I use is a tool called Qgis. It is an open source program. The download to this, we'll send out the link to the PowerPoint later on, or it may already have been sent. Qgis is free. I find it's pretty easy to use. I know, Karen, you use Arcgis, so you'll probably talk a little bit about some of those tools. But there's actually a downloadable tool in QGIS that allows you to do geocoding using the US Census Bureau. And so this tool is really useful. It's not always the most accurate. I'm sure there's geocoders that are more accurate, but it's still particularly useful for what we do in IE. And then we have US Census Bureau also has a super comprehensive list of shapefiles for everything from district boundaries for your legislators, from cities. And then if you want more granular data about community colleges, the Foundation for Community Colleges has some great shapefiles for you to use in your analysis of particular districts. So the other thing that we might use for is trying to find where we might be underserving different populations. And I find that this term underserving oftentimes can be sort of a battle of different intentions. Frequently, we want to talk about underserving a different racial group. And if that's the case, then let's just look at demographics about a particular racial group. But sometimes there's this attitude of like, well, let's use geography as a means of proxying that. But let's just use the data we have. There are still implications, though, for looking at geography as a potential area where we have systematically underserved. This is an analysis I actually did for our non-credit area, and you can see that despite North Long Beach being a particularly low-income community, we actually don't reach out to enough students in that community. And this is largely the result. This is a historically more African-American community. Our non-credit is predominantly ESL. And that's a community that just doesn't have the same language needs as a predominantly immigrant community that we have down here near downtown Palm Beach. So those are the types of things that we can pick out when we look at some of our demographics and layer it on to some of what we know about these communities. So, like I mentioned before, selecting how we bin or how we place people in geographies is really important. Sometimes we can introduce systemic biases if we're introducing bins that were created based on systemic inequalities. And other times, some of those bins were based on political realities that were really empowering. West Hollywood was created in the 1980s, I think, right around the AIDS epidemic. There was a concern from the LGBT community about their access to equitable policing service that really, that really was cognizant of the AIDS epidemic and its impact to that community. And they formed their own city to be able to form their own police department. That was empowering. But it also means that that community disproportionately may represent a demographic of LGBT folks that, is not necessarily indicative of the entire population of South Hollywood community. The other thing, the lagunas, for those of you who are from Orange County, you know that this is an area that there's one in particular that is literally a retirement community, which means that people there are disproportionately older. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're looking at demographics there. So I always start with the census data. I always look at the database. For those of you who are census nerds, you know that the census data came out like last week. It is amazing, wonderful. Kudos to our census folks because they are amazing. So one of the key ways we can do that, we can use some of this data is by determining unobservables. So for those of you who work in non-credit world, you know that, for example, like things relating to income are often hard to get at when we don't have access to FAFSA data. So how we can determine students' potential income, census data can be really useful for that. If we know that students come substantially from this part of North Long Beach, we can make some pretty educated guesses about what their income might be. We might assume, it may not always be a proper assumption, so we have to be careful, that folks that come from those communities are probably low income. In this case, what I was doing an analysis where I was trying to estimate what are the community factors that impact a student. So a student may be white, middle income, but they live in a community that doesn't look like them. They may live in a community that's predominantly students of color. They might be predominantly students from immigrant backgrounds or low income. So how might that lived experience impact the student's outcomes or impact the likelihood to enroll? Because it may be very different from the experiences of a wealthy white student who lives in a wealthy white community. And so in this case, what we were looking at was, how many of our students fit into these different sort of community buckets of high income, predominantly immigrant, high income, largely immigrant communities, low income, large immigrant communities, and then layering it on with different demographics we might have of our students. We know that this high income, large immigrant community, we have a lot of our students come from an area called Cerritos. That is a predominantly Asian community that's pretty well off. But then we also have a large Cambodian community that is predominantly still low income after the horror of the Cambodian genocide in the 1970s and 80s. And so that particular lived experience is very important for our community that lives down here in the downtown area. So all of these stories are really interesting ways in which we can look at student experiences. Again, we use different geocodes, shapefiles, demographic information to really get at what those different experiences are, and then tacking that on to potential individual student level information. So one of the ways in which all of this can be packaged in a really impactful way is legislative advocacy. And we found some success with doing this in the past couple of years. So this is a view sheet I actually made for our local trustees. We had a new trustee that joined our board at the last election. The rest of our trustees have been around for a little bit longer. And so we wanted to create a way of sharing this information with her based on the demographic, based on her actual board district boundaries, rather than using zip codes, which in our case doesn't really work very well for our board of trustees districts. They don't align very well. We actually geocoded all of our student addresses and then mapped them to a shapefile that I have of our board district boundaries. And you can see that she's in a really interesting area, because even though she has an equivalent number of people living in her district to the other 4 board members, she does not have an equivalent number of students, because she lives in a predominantly older, wealthier, whiter neighborhood than the rest of our other board districts. And so it's an interesting dynamic, because she ultimately represents far fewer students, but represents the same number of taxpayers, which is really the unit of analysis that's used when we define these board districts. And you can see that, we invested about $6.1 million in state apportionment to her students. And then we also have a large number of community organizations that we've partnered with in her district that she can then, know that these are groups that have engaged with the college and different work that we've done. We also had an interesting dynamic where a lot of our local hospitals were moving to get magnet status. For those of you who are aware of that, magnet status essentially means that they will employ fewer 2-year RNs. They move to a system that is more based on 4-year bachelor's degree RNs. This meant that we were in danger of losing some of our contracts with our local hospitals to do nursing skills labs. And so we wanted to go to our state legislators and advocate on behalf of our nursing students to make sure that funding was still there. And so this was a view sheet we had where we actually, legislators like seeing pictures of themselves. We put that in there. And making sure that he was aware of how many nursing students were in his particular district, and knowing that this is a huge pathway of our low-income students towards great living wage jobs, heroic jobs, as we've known now in the past year. So we want to make sure that we maintained equitable access to those careers for our students, and that pathway was not closed off. So now we get to fancy statistical methods. You can see I've made the slide fancy to be applicable to the fancy statistical methods. And this actually goes to some work I did in my graduate program to talk a little bit about some other tools that we might do. And I would be really interested in if any of you decide to kind of go down this path. So a couple of my classmates and I were really curious about the issue of residential segregation. And as I talked a little bit before, this period of development in Los Angeles in particular, but also for the Bay Area and San Diego, and even parts of the Central Valley and Inland Empire, was really, really critical to how we built our infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and political infrastructure, and how that then, translates to, how we define colleges today. So this was actually a map that was built in late 1930s, early 1940s of residential segregation based on the security of a loan. Now, this is what now we call racial redlining. It said that a community that was quote unquote high risk, which was coded language for low income, community of color, or a Jewish community, this was very much ingrained with patterns of anti-Semitism, and also then translated to your ability to get loans from the federal government during the Great Depression. So it was very, very problematic and very much ingrained in sort of the patterns of home ownership in the 1930s. You can see this is actually some work, an actual description of East LA in the 1940s. And you can see up at the top, the first thing they remark upon is that there are Jewish, Slavic, Greek, American, Mexicans, Japanese, Italians, subversive racial elements are increasing. So this is very much tied to racism in the 1930s and 40s. And as you'll see, it had profound impacts to LA even today. Brad, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to voice a few questions here in the chat. First one was, is Catalina Island part of Lbcc's service area?
It is part of our service area, and it is really fun to serve Catalina Island. It's very complicated.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, you have a port, so you should be able to accept.
We have a port. It costs like $70 to go out there. So you can imagine serving that community is really an interesting challenge. And it's, yeah, we get a lot of questions about it. We found out recently that weed production is a growing industry on the island. So that was an interesting conversation to have with the board.
Interesting. Another question here. The maps on the right in the advocacy slide, slide 12, were those generated in Qgis?
So these were actually, I actually generated these in Tableau. This whole view sheet actually made in Tableau. And what I was able to do, I took all those Geo Codes that we had, that we made through Qgis, put them in our database, and then pulled it into Tableau. So we could make it a little bit more interactive, and I didn't then have to build out the whole like view sheet in GIS. It's nonsensical in a lot of ways.
Got it. And the final question here, I think you might have partially answered it just now, is were you doing spatial joins or spatial joins to glean income data at the tract level based on geocoded addresses? Did you do that in Tableau?
I did that in, I believe what I did was I had two tables. Both had the geocoded census tract of the student and then also of the demographic information, and I joined them in Tableau. But you could easily do it in GIS as well. Either way, spatial join. I do the spatial join to get the actual census tract. So that's where the spatial join occurs. And then with that census tract number, I can then match it to the census data, either in Tableau or GIS. Either one could work.
All right, that'll clear our questions out of the chat. Thanks.
So with looking at some of this redlining information, you can see, like I mentioned, this is very clearly based on race, and really negatively impacted the access of marginalized communities to get access to loans in the 1930s. So we were curious, like, what impact does this have today? I had a theory that this was incredibly influential on how LA developed. And so what we did was we pulled out several million different home addresses from the LA County Tax Assessor's database. We sewed them together onto this information from this excellent shapefile from the University of Richmond in Virginia. And then we were able to calculate how far a particular house was from a boundary line. So these boundary lines, we would look at the most problematic boundary line than the ones that were given privilege status. And then we measured what the actual differences were in the price of a home. And you can see that among houses that were just a quarter of a mile from a boundary line, so houses that were essentially the same, you could see that there was a $270,000 difference between homes on the positive end of that boundary line and the negative end of that boundary line. And this is in 2019, not in 1939, not in 1942, and not in 1965. This is, to this day, there is a $270,000 difference in the price of a home between those two different areas. And so you can see in this graph, this is like shows us sort of where that gap occurs. And what we used was a tool called Regression Discontinuity modeling. So some of you may be familiar with that, essentially looking at what were essentially two identical homes on either side of a boundary line and then measuring what the difference was in price value. So what does that mean? Well, it means that for marginalized folks that still may live in some of those communities, which is very much the case, this includes parts of South LA, we know are predominantly African-American, predominantly low income, predominantly Latino. It means that their ability to accrue value to their home is much more limited because they live in this racialized dynamic that was created decades before. So what does that then mean for colleges? Well, it means that we have to be cognizant of the fact the way in which our colleges were structured was often based on these patterns of home ownership that were based on racialized demographics in the 1930s, 1940s, and well beyond that. So, you know, not to end on a dark note, but these are the types of things that geography can help us get at. And they're often buried amongst this layer of sort of political dynamics and different political boundary lines that we know, have been perpetuated through the decades since. So that is what I have. Thank you, everybody.
Any other questions for Tim at this point?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you use Stata for make the correlation?
For this project, I did. But generally what I do, we use SPSS for our internally for our IE office.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Hi.
So Tim, can you describe a little bit more about that regression model that you used? What technology did you use to run it? And then I'm not familiar with the discontinuous, I think is how you described it. So maybe just tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so what regression discontinuity allows us to do is it allows us, based on what we know theoretically, there should be nothing different about homes on either side of that boundary, except things directly related to that particular redlining district. And so especially homes at the very close margin between that boundary line. So for example, like let's say we had, Imperial Highway down here in Orange County. A home on the north side of Imperial Highway is probably not all that different from a home on the south side of Imperial Highway. The differences are probably fairly similar, at least in ways related to that boundary line. And that's the key part that became the center point of our analysis. What we considered was that these particular boundary lines were created at a point in LA's development that everything relating to how those homes might be different was probably related to something related to that boundary line. So let's say, for example, the presence of a highway. We know, for example, in the 1950s, when the Interstate Highway Act was passed, that a lot of decisions about where highways were placed in LA was based on whether a community was high income, low income, marginalized, or non-marginalized. And so we have to say that the data that was used in the 1950s was probably directly correlated with these boundary lines created in the 1940s. And so as you sort of piece it through, there's very few things that's really not related to racial redlining. And so that allows us to essentially say that at the margin relating to those two on either side of that boundary line, we don't really need to control for any other observables. And so it's a very clean way of estimating what the difference is between different prices on either side of the boundary line if we're able to control simply for the distance from a boundary line. So as far as tools we use with GIS, what I was able to do, I geocoded all of the homes in LA County. My computer hated me for about 2 weeks because it was a lot of data. And my computer, being in Zoom school world, I didn't have access to like supercomputers. I was able to then place them in the boundaries from the 1940s. And then I measured the distance to one of those high privilege and low privilege boundary lines. And then that was our what's called the running variable. And then, the treatment effect was, were they in the district, were they not? And so that was how we were able to do the model. As far as limits on the number of addresses you can upload to QGIS, if you do it direct through the census, there's a 10,000 unit limit. If you do it through QGIS, you can actually do more. But I will say, I tend to try and stick to batches of like 50,000 at a time because it slows down. And sometimes it looks like it's broken, but it's not, it's still working. So just keep that in mind. I play around with different batch numbers, but I did, the first batch I ever did was 900,000 addresses. It took a long time, but it did do it. And I had to run multiple batches, but I eventually got through it. Once you do the first batch, you know, every batch after that is going to be smaller.
I have a question about one of your charts that it has the range of income and also the immigration population. Did you get that chart from US Census Bureau data?
I got the data from the Census Bureau, and then I was using the census tract. I was able to sew that onto our enrollment data. And so the size of the dot in that chart represented how many
Students.
that represented how many students live in that particular tract.
But the actual basic chart was from US census that make like kind of where are like high low income or high income and high
I made the tract as far as like the qualitative determination of like what's high income and what's low income. I actually used the county average, and then anything above the average would be high income, anything below the average would be low income.
Oh, okay. So you have and what was your threshold income?
Whatever the county average was, or the county median. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
There's other ways you could certainly do that, but I figured that, you know, I did that kind of like an hour before the presentation. So I was like, oh, this would be an easy way of doing that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. As far as do you need knowledge of spatial econometrics? No. I mean, you know, econometrics in general are of course useful. As far as spatial goes, I mean, I learned when I needed to do that analysis from like just reading some articles. The methodology of regression discontinuity, I find it works really, really well for spatial data. But that discontinuity method is actually used in a lot of forms of education that are not related to spatial data. So like there's a lot of work relating to the efficacy of the SAT that uses regression discontinuity by looking at students that were just like one point below like admission and 1 point above. They're essentially the same student, but one got admitted to college and the other one didn't. So yeah, there we go. We got some resources put in the chat there. So.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions at this point, we can go ahead and turn it over to Karen. Just wanted to note that there is some time after the conclusion of her presentation for more dialogue if things come up. All right, you ready, Karen?
Yeah. And I'm just gonna. So my name is Karen Snow, and I'm just gonna show you generalized mapping tools and some free resources. So as in Tim's presentation, for the Foundation for California Community Colleges has GIS data and a GIS map viewer that we all have access to. They also have discounted funding for software, which they use Esri as their service, and that's what you would be getting a discount for. And here's what it would look like. So this is like a map service, just any kind of plug-in on your website. You can get it from several different companies. The foundation just happens to use Esri. So it's an integrated viewer. And so you also have access to the tables, and you can use filters and turn on different layers and see different geographies, such as boundary lines or school points. They have that already created for you. And you can do measurements. So sometimes this is important if you want to look at the distance between. So Tim was talking about a very urban area. If you have a more rural area, that this comes into play. Distance students have to travel from, you know, for transportation or distance between sites. And they also, all of their data is available as a download bundle. And that it's formatted for, the base map is formatted for Esri, but the others are also just generalized shape files that you can use in like QGIS, or there's several different free softwares. And this is what it looks like in their ArcGIS online content. So if you have an ArcGIS online account, they are free. You can pull in this service that's specifically for the California community colleges and use it. So you're not creating your own data, you're just using it. And here you can, this is how you pull in a service or share within ArcGIS Online. So you are pulling things in, and you can do this not just from CCGIS, you can pull it from any map service that's publicly available on ArcGIS Online content. And you can make base maps, and you can look at anything you want to look at that's already created. And you can also upload your own data. If you have your own data sets, you can upload it here. So if you want to look at ArcGIS Online, they have free accounts, low-cost personal accounts, and then they have professional and level accounts. The free training, it comes in several different forms. You can do like online lessons, and they're step-by-step, and it's all free content. And you can watch YouTube videos. They have their own YouTube channel. They also have, you know, articles that outline how a case study was done. And then they also have this thing called Discovery Paths. So if you want to look at a more focused, like not just in general, anything about GIS, if you have a very specific question, you can look through their paths, and then they'll have a path to train you on that. And they also have Esri Learn. This started out, I would say 18 months ago, and it was beta, and now it is a full service, and there's lots of free teaching here. And you can start at the very basic, new users, and then they have students, data scientists, many different tracks that you can follow there. And the online base map, it goes from very basic to very detailed. You can do satellite imagery. It's all available free content. And then there's also ArcGIS Pro and desktop mapping. So ArcGIS Pro here, it has a lot of look and feel like the QGIS. And then the ArcGIS map is the standard, what everyone was used to for the last 20 years. It has a lot, it's just there on your computer, and whereas you can get onto ArcGIS Pro online, and the licensing is easier to share. But the difference here is wherein if you're using ArcGIS Online, it's more limited in actually creating your own content. And these are paid services, and they can range from a personal account being $100 to being the very top level being $3,800. And going to free data, the U.S. Census has what they call their geography program. So here you can use their interactive maps that are already created, and or you can use their data. And the state of California has a GIS portal, and also there theirs is very robust because they have a very large county. And so here is where you would also, as opposed to the, for the federal, you would get like parcels and very specialized projects that they've, that the county has done and has put out either as a service or as the actual data files. Sacramento County has the same kind of portal, but you need to really look at where the area where you're at. Mostly what there's spatial layers, there's tables, there's the county apps that are specific to programs in that county. So that's very useful for you, the boundaries. But I think like the biggest one there is looking at current projects and also the parcel data, because the parcel data that you're going to get from there to create geo coding is more accurate, updated yearly. Oh, and that's it. And I have this as a PDF if you guys want to use any of the links to look at any of the free services. And that's it. Let's see, how do I stop sharing?
All right, so we thought we'd follow up these presentations with just some sort of guiding discussion, a dialogue similar to our peer-to-peer sessions. We had some questions I was wondering if folks might want to jump in on and help get answered. So one of them was, how do you think GIS can help with issues related to strategic enrollment management, access, and basic needs? Another area of discussion that we were looking at is when is GIS appropriate and when is it not? And if anybody can share examples of how your campuses are using GIS, that would also be really helpful. So I was wondering, Karen or Tim, wondering if you could get us started with one of these discussions here. Anyone that you think you might be passionate or have some insight on.
Yeah, you know, with the appropriateness question, you know, it's interesting. I've had a lot of conversations at our school where there often is this sort of like, you know, you'll hear this in a lot of conversations where people say, well, people from that community, right? It's kind of coded language for a different racial or ethnic group or a different socioeconomic group. And frequently they'll default, because they have this mindset of that community and making sure that we're serving, you know, a particular group, they'll have a default assumption to geography as the appropriate way of gauging that. But frequently it's not, because if it is in fact that we're looking for information relating to a particular ethnic group or income related group, like I mentioned, I think I mentioned this before, it's better just to go to the source, right? Because frequently what we know is that, you know, there are marginalized people that live in contained communities that, you know, because of different policies of the past are segregated to certain parts of the community. But that's not always the case. There are folks that, you know, live in communities that don't look and are not the same as their own. So by doing that, by sort of ingraining that concept that, you know, students from that community, you know, only live in that community, we're sort of like perpetuating it over and over and over again. And we're ignoring that there are many students that may live in other communities as well. So that's a situation where, you know, if it is in fact that you're working with a stakeholder and the stakeholder is actually looking for information on race, then, you know, defaulting to geography, I don't find is particularly a useful way of going about doing that.
So I would say, yes, we're aware of the implications of using existing boundaries, but also I'm aware of the fact that many programs and grants that are funded are also based on those geographies. And so I would say that was the bulk of my work for the different institutions that I've been at, and that I've done for local schools, you know, that just didn't have access to anything. It's a requirement in order to get grant funding for it to be based on either a census tract or a zip code or within a city boundary or within a county boundary, and being able to, you know, apply for programs based on, you know, where students live and showing that they fall into like just a set list of, you know, approved areas is very helpful in order to get funding. So I think that there's that balance that you don't want to perpetuate any kind of systemic racism or any kind of, you know, disadvantage to your students, but also if it is an advantage for the students to use this, you know, geography in order to get more funding, and that's the only way they're being evaluated by different entities, I use it for that.
Thank you. I was wondering if anybody else in our audience today has examples of how you might be using GIS at your institution.
We actually, oh, can I talk? I'm Heide from Santiago. So we actually did kind of the analysis with GIS with partnership with Cal State Fullerton, and we actually compared the low income status of our students and compare with the student who living in low income area. And interestingly, like it shows, the result was that the student who live in low income area was kind of more better predictor for success compared with the students who have low income status at our campus. So I think it's important to look at the places that the students live and also look at their low income status.
Thank you. Eric, I see you have a hand up.
Yeah, I'm just going to share something we've been working on at Sierra College, which is very small scale for GIS. We're very fortunate that we passed a bond a couple of years ago and have a boatload of construction projects going on campus. And Jenny Allen, who's somewhere in the presentation, in the webinar, put together something that shows a heat map of when buildings are busy by time of day. And so we're providing that for our facilities folks so that they can try to schedule you know, deliveries, interruptions, et cetera, at times that are sort of minimally impacted for those areas of campus. So very small scale, not necessarily addressing some of the big picture issues, but you know, still a way that we're trying to use that technology.
Thanks, Eric. CJ, see you have a hand up?
Yeah, we've done some examples with the Strong Workforce Program and looking at stackable degrees and certificates, and also areas where there's job opportunities based on labor market information. And this is really helpful for our different students who, based on drive radius, especially those that are staying local for family support, where they may find themselves finding opportunities based off of their current education path or a path they may be pursuing.
Wonderful, thanks. And if anybody wants to share something, just let me know. I can give you share screen privileges. Terrence.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. A couple of examples. A few years ago, the county wanted to build a new pedestrian bridge near the college. And so we did geocoding of our students with different walk radiuses, radii, sorry, to help them out with their planning. That was good fun. And then just this last year, I got to make a heat map looking, it was kind of an unfortunate heat map, but we're looking at early semester student drops by geography to compare one part of our county that had been hit harder by COVID, and then the other part of our county that got hit by the CZU fire last year, to look at enrollments and drops by geography. So those are a couple of more recent examples. And then just yesterday, I found that I've been updating our e-fact book in Power BI, and you guys may have talked about this. Sorry for joining late, but they have this native map visualization in Power BI, but new to me at least, they've got a connection to Esri. And I was able to log in my Esri Online account to then map enrollments by zip code and by state. And then you can choose a base map that they provide through Esri. And I thought that was pretty cool. Nice, quick and easy way to make a map inside a Power BI. So just a couple of examples there.
Thank you, Terrence. Does anybody have any questions about this work? Getting started, taking it to the next level? The floor is yours. Yeah, Brandon?
I have a question about, at Valley, we were looking at like the enrollment and just kind of the locations and communities where our students are coming from. And what I've been doing so far is just trying to map their postal code onto a shapefile. But that was really frustrating because when I realized the city and the postal, they didn't necessarily align all the time. So it wasn't a very fair representation of it. And I was really fascinated by what Tim's presentation on the geocoding. I was wondering are we able to use the Geo Codes and map it onto a shapefile, or are there certain limitations to what you can map the geocode onto?
It's a two-step process. The geocode, if you do it through the census, they actually will give you whatever the census tract is, or just automatically. But the geocoding process is simply just the process of getting a latitude and longitude for a given point. So like, let's say you have somebody who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, right? Like it will tell you that the latitude and longitude is 118.66699, whatever, by 69.3 or whatever. And then from there, you do what's called a spatial join. And that's essentially like you're taking a shapefile and you're kind of cookie cuttering it down on your map of latitudes and longitudes. And then GIS will tell you, okay, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is in Washington, DC. And that's the process that you would go to get, for example, if you wanted, I completely empathize with you with postcodes, like, especially if you live in, this is something I have to give a lot of shout out to my friends at North Orange Continuing Ed. They pointed out the fact that LA and Orange County have added zip codes a lot, especially if you have a college that has any number of seniors or people who've lived in an area for a long time. They may have been using the wrong postal code for forever because their postcode changed, but the post office is nice and they just deliver it to you anyway. And so you may want to do a geocoding process where you get updated addresses and then map it onto a new file of zip codes and improve all of that data and make everybody happy. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. That's another one of those projects that I think may have unexpected returns for communications or something like that too.
Thank you.
Tim, there's a question about your program in the chat.
So I did my bachelor's at Cal State Fullerton in poli-sci and economics. I didn't really do any geographic stuff there, although I did try. And then I did my master's at USC in public policy. And there I didn't necessarily take any formal GIS classes, but I did do some trainings and workshops and then applied that to some econometrics work I was doing. So
Okay, I'm going to jump in on this one too. I got my bachelor's in sociology and urban studies and planning at Cal State Bakersfield, and that's where I learned all of my GIS. And I did my master's at Claremont Graduate University, but I didn't do it in GIS. I did it in IT instead, but they do have a GIS program there. And being a GISP in the state, any discipline can use GIS for whatever they're, so your question was about epidemiology and biostats. Yes, there's lots of them. There's lots of geology, sociology, whatever field you're in, GIS can apply because 80% of the data that you make and have already has geographical location. So you can use it to just create a database that's spatially aware. So when Tim was discussing geocoding and you're using that shapefile to cookie cut an area, it's just the extra step is you already have all of that data there. There's already a way to locate it. Even think about how when you're registering students in your classrooms, when they are doing classroom management, they have to, you already have building numbers and classroom numbers. There's lots of ways that you on your campuses already hold geographic data, and then you're just using an added tool in order to extract it based on that location. And actually a lot of community colleges give GIS training. I actually did a class at American River College because everything was on Zoom last semester, and I wanted to check out the new features in the newest ArcGIS Pro, and I thought it would be funner to do it with other people than just to try to, update my skills on my own. So you can check that out. I think there's still classes that were traditionally online that are staying online, even though everyone's going back to on campus.
All right, was there anybody else who wanted to jump in? I see you again, Terrence.
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to ask a question, and hopefully it wasn't covered in the beginning. So you talk, in GIS, we think a lot about Esri, being a premier product. Did you guys touch on other vendors or particularly open source? And is that, I looked into it in the past, but I always go back to Esri. Any reason to look further than that?
I use QGIS, which is one of the open source ones. I actually find it's easier to use than when I was using Esri. I know that'll be a debate. The only I know, shocked face. It was particularly useful for me as a student because it was free. And otherwise, I would have had to have logged into a virtual machine to use Esri. And the other thing is they have plugins that are adapted based on users. But sometimes those plugins are more useful than others. One time I tried a new geocoding and realized that the entire process was in German. I do not speak German. So that is, that's one of the downsides of it. And it can be a little bit glitchy sometimes, if I'm being honest. But for those of you who are more maybe looking to just kind of get some experience but don't want to have to pay for something right now, it's a great kind of entry level starting off point. And it has a lot of things I just built out something in Modeler the other day. So it does a lot of the same things as Esri. It's just not maybe as pretty looking or is sort of user friendly in its visuals than Esri.
So
sorry, what was that called again?
QGIS.
Q?
Yeah, like the letter Q.
Okay.
And a lot of people that will use Esri products or whatever product they happen to use is because that's just what they learned when they first started. So that's what Cal State Bakersfield had. So that's what I used. And it just happened to be widely used when I went into the workforce after that. And also, if you're going to take a class at one of the community colleges, they are not using the open source. They're using, the student version of Esri because they can get both licenses and it's easier. And I will say that there's a lot more free accessible Esri stuff online now. But as Terrence said before, and as Tim said, once you have the data, it's just essentially a table, and you can pull it into whatever you're using. I pull files in all the time to SPSS if I want to run a specific analysis and I don't want to learn the whole process again, in the newest version of whatever. I'll just, I think many of us do that. We fall back onto what we're used to using. I know one of my coworkers, I always would geocode for him so that he could use that for Tableau. So, and now that's why I was trying to show you a lot of the different sites that you can go to. A lot of places have viewers and you can add data in and pull data out. And there's a lot you can do without actually having to purchase, or you can just use free accounts. Like I have $100 a year account and I can do everything I want to do, for myself. And I have a lot of plugins every other place where I need to pull data from. So I just bring it right in. So there's a lot of different options if you don't want to make a big investment. And what I like about Esri, there's a lot of documentation and there's step-by-step videos and screenshots for everything you want to do. So if you don't want to take the time to really learn it and figure out every little thing, you can follow a lesson really quickly in 20 minutes and do what you need to do.
Daniel, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, in regards to Terrence's question, I'll give you a brief my brief history of working with GIS. I tried GIS, I tried the Esri product for several years and I kept on getting frustrated with it. All I wanted to do was map my students. And I think I tried probably 3 or 4 years and I gave it up. And the next year I tried it again. I just couldn't figure it out. I asked for help and was able to get very far. I finally heard about this company that was doing the voting things for the Riverside County. I made an appointment with them and they told me about a software that I've been using ever since. It's called Maptitude. And they said they didn't have any stock in the company. I did not have stock in the company, but I was able to geocode and map my students the same afternoon that I got it. So I've been very happy with that product. And so I just thought I'd let you know it's not free, it's not open source. I don't think it's terribly expensive, but I think it's very easy to use.
Thank you, Daniel.
Didn't they used to be partnered up with SPSS a long time ago?
I don't know the answer to that question, but yeah, so I don't know. But like I said, I found it very easy to use. We've done various things with maps, mostly mapping our students, but it's been a very helpful piece of software for us.
So due to the interest in this particular topic area, I just figured I'd share that the ARPI group has partnered with an instructor at Rio Hondo College. He's a GIS instructor named Warren Roberts, and he's done drive-in workshops for us in the past. And just wondering if I could, I don't know, maybe put a 1 in the chat if that might be something that you would be interested in attending. I'm not sure quite where we would host that since the state's so big, but he's typically done what he suggested here in the past, like a 3-day workshop. Day 1 would be what is GIS? the basics of geocoding, data sources. The second day would be spatial questions, Esri insights, and the third day would be web and story mapping, online services, community and business analyst. I'm not really sure what that means, and infographics. So. All right, so go ahead.
Community analyst is like the kind of free community map that people all contribute to. And then business analyst is paid data where they've done a lot of analysis for you, and it's updated yearly so that all of the economic and LMI data is integrated in there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. All right, so I will reconnect with Warren and see about setting something up. Thanks, everyone. Anybody else have anything to add before we wrap up today? All right, well, thank you all for attending. It's been a wonderfully engaging discussion, and I've learned a lot, so I hope you have too. Please be sure to complete our evaluation if you get a moment. It's linked in the chat, and I'll be following up with a copy of the PowerPoints for those who might have shown up late. And you can also expect that an archive of this presentation will be posted on the RP website in the near future. So thanks, everybody. Hope to see you at the next opportunity. Thanks.